made it.
Hello again. I am your AI co-host, and welcome to 3.8. 3.8 is a podcast focused on the process of doing and the process of novel invention, all from the foundation of creativity. Each month will bring you no more than 5 episodes through the lens of art, science, and/or technology. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/38 or at ko-fi.com/38. Today we speak with Melissa Wray. Melissa is the founding director of Mainspring, a nonprofit arts and cultural center in Caledonia, Minnesota, and is program director at the multidisciplinary rural arts organization Lanesboro Arts. They discuss her return to rural Caledonia after 13 years in Minneapolis, Minnesota, her work with Mainspring, a community arts organization, and the importance of art in rural communities. And now, the humans.
All right, today we're joined with Melissa. Melissa, where does this podcast find you?
Yeah, I'm at home in Caledonia, Minnesota, which is the southeastern corner of the state.
For those who don't know anything about any of that, whereabout is that located in the world?
Caledonia is in the very southeastern corner of the state of Minnesota in the Midwest. And so we're literally the furthest southeast that you can go, bordering Wisconsin and Iowa. And it's the driftless region, we call it, in this area, which is a part of a few of these states in this area in the Midwest that didn't get glaciated. And so there's a lot of rolling hills and bluffs and valleys. And yeah, it's a beautiful area, but it's definitely rural. Yeah. We're about in 45 minutes to an hour from the nearer bigger cities, quote unquote. And yeah, it's a great place to be.
So it's not flat like the rest of the Midwest?
No, it is not flat. Very much the opposite.
I get that a lot. And I tell people about the driftless region because it's really fucking cool. If you haven't looked into it, maybe I'll link it or something. But that's 300 or 400 miles of kind of stretch along the Mississippi, mostly where there was no glaciers or they split or some fucking thing happened. The aliens came or whatever. And it's not pummeled. So the topography is pretty varied. I think it's probably similar to like a West Virginia almost with they call them hollers. We call them probably coulees or dells.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Every time people come to visit, they're like, I had no idea this existed in Minnesota. So yeah, great place.
And so you've lived there pretty much forever? Or?
Yes. So I grew up in Caledonia and left as soon as I could for college. I went to the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities and I ended up loving it there. And I stayed there for undergrad and my graduate degree. And then I also just lived there. So I was there for a total of 13 years and I loved it. And I traveled a lot in that interim time as well around the country and the world. After I got my master's, which was in arts and cultural leadership, so really focusing on nonprofit arts management, that's when I started to think about moving back home, as I called it, and had always kind of felt this pull between both the Twin Cities and Southeast Minnesota. So I finally made that move in 2019 to move back here, and I've been here ever since. So 2019 was when I came home.
Yeah, it's pre-COVID.
Yeah, pre-COVID, right before that. Weird times.
BC, before COVID.
Yep.
So you can live anywhere in the world, or at least in the country, pretty easily. So you talked a little bit about the draw, but I think maybe for context, like Minneapolis is definitely the biggest city in the state of Minnesota. I think 2/3 of the population exists basically in the metro region of the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities. The rest of the state, pretty rural. There's a couple, I'd call them medium-sized towns, every few hundred miles or so, but it's pretty desolate. A lot of agriculture or wildland. So what brought you back? That feels like a pretty staunch difference. And then also with your chosen field of arts administration, that kind of thing, most people probably associate that with big cities or at least museums and that kind of thing. But so why did you choose to go home and leave the city, so to speak?
Yeah, I think I have always been someone who, I was raised by parents who are very involved in community things, even though they maybe didn't always want to be, but they viewed that as a responsibility. And so I felt like in the Twin Cities, there were so many amazing social justice movements happening, so many really amazing organizations that were doing work that I respected. And I got to work for a lot of these nonprofits that I really loved. But it felt like I was just another white cis woman that they didn't need in the Twin Cities, why do they don't need me. There's so many other amazing people doing more important work there. And the work that I felt like I could contribute to would be a part of is in rural communities, because I grew up in a rural community that I still loved and had this like emotional tie back to for whatever reason. And I don't think it's a community that someone who has never been here before would come to and be like, oh, you know what? I want to make this my home and make this a place that I want to build up. So I'm here because of this complex, nuanced love I have for this place, and wanting to be a part of growth for a better community and a more resilient community. And I obviously love this place too. I think in the Twin Cities, there's so much to do and so much stimulation around me, but I craved the quietude that you get when you're in a rural place. And just walking in the woods on my parents' farm where I grew up is something that has always been the most calming thing to me. So being able to move home to that and have the nature right outside my back door, it felt really like a big pull.
Yeah. I hear that. And like, I live in Portland, Oregon right now. And one of the reasons I love this area is kind of the similar, thing that you were saying, is the outdoors is actually accessible here. Where when I lived in the Bay Area, it was like a 3 or 4 hour drive in traffic to do another 2 or 3 hour drive to actually get to nature, or at least like enough quote unquote wilderness where there's not just people everywhere. And I think rural areas, especially in that area of the Driftless region, is so undervalued in terms of, I think, what people call outdoor recreation now. I just call it like growing up. Right? But year round, if you dress warm in the winter, it's not too bad, but there's always stuff to do, and you kind of learn how to make your own fun, so to speak. Whereas I feel like in a city, you have a lot of cultural entertainment options, but it's a very different vibe. I think you kind of hit on it too. There's this like busyness that there's always this energy in the background. And when I feel like, at least when I'm outside or in the woods, there's a different kind of like alertness and awareness that you have, but it's also feels way more therapeutic, because like I don't ever get exhausted coming out of the woods or doing a hike or being on the water. I mean, maybe I'm a little physically exerted, but it's not even the same as like being in a gym, right? It's like you kind of feel good and also maybe tired, or your body's fatigued. But so yeah, I definitely get that. And then, of course, anyone who knows the area or the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, land of lakes, right? So there's a lot of water stuff, but when it comes to topography differences, not so much.
Yep. Yeah, we've got the Mississippi not that far from here, and lots of places to kayak, and the river runs through this area. So yeah, there's lots of outdoor things that we do. And I think you definitely have to get comfortable with being alone with yourself, which I think is something that I wasn't always good at. And I've learned over many years to try to build that muscle for myself. But yeah, I love it here. I used to always feel split when I lived in the Twin Cities between Caledonia and the Twin Cities. And now that I've moved here, I don't feel that split. I still miss the Twin Cities. I still visit often, but yeah, I feel like I'm here.
It's interesting. You hit on like being alone with yourself. It's like the one thing I find when I talk to people or meet people who haven't lived in a rural area, or they think they live in a rural area and they're in a town of like 100,000 people. And it's like, yeah, that's a small town for, America in a lot of ways, but like pretty big place. You have culture, there's investment. You're pretty rural, and being alone with yourself or your thoughts, or like long drives, or even just going to do stuff is a little bit more challenging. How do you feel the difference between the rural living and the urban living is for that? I think a lot of people spend a lot of time commuting in cities. If you work remote or whatever, a lot of people maybe just spend time at home. But I don't feel like it's the same, though. Do you agree or disagree on that?
Yeah, I had long commutes in the Twin Cities, driving 45 minutes to drive a handful of miles. And here I actually work at another organization in Lanesboro, which is a town that's about 45, 50 minutes west of here. And so I go in usually 2 to 3 days a week, and then I work from home the other days. But on those drives in, it's still a 45-minute drive, but it's through the countryside. And it's like, I always joke that the most traffic I get is during harvest season, when there's like a combine I get stuck behind or an Amish buggy that I get stuck behind. And it's a very different experience. And I feel like I actually crave those long drives, drives. Before I even started going to therapy in life, those long drives were always my like way of processing and thinking and reflecting on what was going on in my life. And I love my long drives, honestly. It just resets for me something that I didn't have in the Twin Cities when I was having to pay attention to, am I going to get rear-ended on the highway or something? So a very different experience, Yeah,
and when I was in the Bay too, like I had a long commute it was long in miles and long in hours. And I would spend sometimes hours in traffic. And I agree. And I found before I moved closer to work, but when I was trying to do it, I couldn't even like listen to music because it wasn't relaxing, because you're in, I think the road I was on was 6 lanes one way. And there's always people lane jockeying, trying to get out the exit, trying to get on the exit, stop and go. You're going 20, you're going 0, you're going 50, you're going 0. So it's like, there's always like a little bit of a stressor. I wouldn't call it anxiety. Like I definitely don't get anxiety driving, but there's always just this alertness that I think is probably pretty similar in the back of your mind of like, you just have to be so focused and attentive and alert or you're going to crash. I love listening to podcasts, audiobooks, that kind of stuff. Couldn't even really do that because I wasn't able to really synthesize or enjoy that moment. It was not that I really enjoy driving long distances on the highway either, but it's a totally different experience for folks. Yep. I know you do some art stuff too. How do you find that? Do you get inspired when you're on those kind of drives, or like when you're spending time alone or even in the woods? Do you get a lot of inspiration from that, or does it help you break through like creative problems, or are you more just kind of like recharging?
Yeah, I think it absolutely helps because I mean, again, like, so drives are really helpful for me. Also long hikes in the woods when I just am walking by myself. And that's where I get a lot of my thinking done, and a lot of the art stuff that I'm working on comes through in those moments. And I think that it's just, again, kind of, I'm able to get into sort of a meditative state and just really spend that time. I think there's something about moving your body and being in nature at the same time. Just a walk in the woods is something that always provides me with some sort of maybe new perspective or a new idea, or just going further on another specific idea. But yeah, it's always been helpful for me to spend that time. And I think it's just like around here, I'm someone who's very empathetic. I pick up on the surroundings around me. So when I'm in really busy spaces or stimulating spaces, it's like hard for me to cut through that noise to figure out where I am. Whereas in quieter spaces like rural places, I'm able to let that part of my brain quiet down and actually listen to what I'm thinking, or come up with ideas as I'm out there. So it helps me a lot.
I don't know if you've ever been forest bathing, but it's a thing people in cities do, and it's what everyone else calls just walking outside. Yeah. But I totally agree with that. It's interesting. And I'm wondering, like, is that just how I'm hardwired, that I'm, what is a kinesthetic kind of person where I prefer to be moving? Or is it something I learned because I've spent a lot of time outside my whole life, especially growing up? It was very much a make your own fun upbringing. Do you ever like get stuck, or maybe you're doing like some sort of art piece and you're just like, it's just not working? Do you ever like then retreat to outside or into the woods or like doing something? Or is it more like you just get inspired as you do it?
No, I definitely get stuck for sure. A lot. And I think, whenever I get stuck, I just need to take a break and walk away. I know I'm lucky enough to have a little studio space, so I can leave that physical space and walk the few blocks home. And that alone just like sometimes helps. Yeah. But I also think that I have so many friends in the Twin Cities and in other rural places and around that are doing similar types of art. And so I'm able to look to them on social media or just their websites, or if they have a blog or whatever it is, and get some inspiration that way too. I definitely still find ways to, get inspired from the people around me, whether or not they're close geography wise or not. But
that's interesting kind of hybrid you have there, because it's like I always talk about getting stuck, and if you're not ever getting stuck, you're not actually doing anything novel because you already know what you're doing. I talk a lot about time off task too. So like you have to put in the work, you have to put in the time. That's just part of life. But it's also, I think, for creativity really important to take time away. And that could be a walk around the block. It could be just like checking in on someone. I love that idea of using Instagram as kind of a like, oh, I wonder what, my friend's up to. I wonder what so-and-so's up to, and getting kind of an asynchronous dose of inspiration from that. How do you find like the reception in rural areas? So I think a lot of people, when you think arts, you're probably thinking New York, you're probably thinking LA, you're probably thinking London, Paris, major cities, big cultural centers, long-standing institutions, museums, theater, the opera, that kind of stuff. And then you're probably thinking of like the poor college student who's like trying to hawk their work at the coffee shop in your town, right? And there's this whole spectrum, of course, in between. But you've done both. You've lived and worked in both kind of urban and rural environments. Like, how do you see the contrast?
So I was lucky enough to be a Rural Regenerator Fellow, which is a fellowship through Springboard for the Arts, Fergus Falls, and they're a large, they have a branch in the Twin Cities and a branch in this smaller town called Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And it's a very generous fellowship that you get an unrestricted stipend over the course of 3 years or 2 years, and then you get to have these gatherings with other rural artists. And it's not just Minnesota based, it's across the whole Midwest. And we keep expanding their footprint as they build this program. But I just finished my second year of the fellowship. And as part of that, I've honestly been finding that some of the most inspiring and genre-pushing artists that I'm excited about right now are living in rural spaces. So I think, and something that we talked about a lot as a cohort, the cohort that I was a part of, is that concept that this is like flyover country and that there's not anything here, there's nothing out there, we kept saying. When there's absolutely so much here, it's spread out and it's in these weird little pockets that you have to look harder to find. But people do exist in these places that are making really powerful art. And I think it's art that is necessary because it's art that's made in these areas where you're able to maybe shut out some of that noise and you're able to focus in on some of these other things, as opposed to being in New York where you're in this bit of a rat race, for lack of a better term, trying to like one up the next art person around you and make sure you're part of the art scene. There's not that pressure. Right. So I think there's something that comes out of both of those places that is valid, but I think it's important to have both of them. And I think too, that's something that we face a lot in a rural community with Mainspring, the nonprofit that I run here in Caledonia, and that art is still kind of an unknown thing to a lot of people who live here. Art feels like a capital A art, and feels like it's intimidating, it's elitist, it's not for them. And so a big part of our work is really making it accessible and talking about art and craft and culture and how that's inherent in everything we do. Since the beginning of people, we've found ways to make pictographs. And like around here, I look around and I see people with barn quilts on their barns, which I think is a form of craft and culture and art in its own way. Farm-to-table cooking, embroidery, all these things that people associate with these rural places are also artistic things of their own right. So I think a lot of our task has been trying to draw connections to the things that are already here and celebrating that, as well as building bridges to some of these other new experiences and other forms of art and artistic support.
Yeah, you hit on a lot of really good stuff. And I think like what I feel like is the most important is that art is an expression. And I think a lot of people have the misconception that it's like a painting or it's music or it's a play or performance. Well, yeah, those are, I think, probably some of the most popular forms of art or the most associated forms. But like you said, cooking is also a form of art, or decorative environments, right? Putting a barn quilt, for folks who don't know, is a visual representation of a quilt on a barn instead of your kind of stereotypical red barn with a silver roof is the norm, or some people will do other colors. But the idea is that you're beautifying the environment, or you're trying to express your unique quilt or your unique color combinations, or however you choose to do that. I think one thing that I've probably due to my upbringing and background is also like any sort of trades work is incredibly artistic, like building a building, building cabinets, woodworking, auto body detail. You get a fender bender, there's people who can make that look like it never happened. And that's a little bit of science probably, but it's more art. It's more understanding aesthetics and applying that. But I don't think even a lot of people in rural areas think about that kind of stuff, because they've been drilled into, you have to go to New York in a fancy theater and it has to take place, or it has to be really expensive, or you have to devote your entire life to the pursuit of the craft. Whereas even in a trades, like my uncle does a lot of woodworking, and I use this example sometimes. Like he's one of the most probably artistic people I know. He'd never consider himself that. But he'll, they built their house. He did all the cabinetry in the kitchen, and it took him, I don't know, probably 10, 15,000 hours. It was a couple of years to get every piece the way they wanted it. But it's just absolutely immaculate the way he did the inlaying. I feel like a lot of that has gone out of vogue in commercial world, because you go to Home Depot and you just buy the finishing instead of having somebody craft it. But there's still all these people who do that. I'm sure there's like barriers to that, right? It's just people in rural areas have that association. And urban area is the same way, right? Going to like a wood craft fair or a wood showing where someone's doing sculpture or even making shit out of wood, probably not going to be a big draw in an urban center either. Maybe it would be, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But do you see any like unique challenges with that? Or have you found any like unique pairings that you maybe wouldn't have expected that people are really like into and or have been really popular as you've been doing stuff?
Yeah. I mean, it takes time to build trust in a community as a new business or organization in our case. And I think also with the added component of art. So we've tried a lot of different things, from simple things of like making our art classes free for youth so that there's no barrier for a young person to come to an art class. But then we also have to balance that with, we want people in this area to also value artists' time and their expertise, right, and that those classes cost money to produce. And so, we have grant funding that we're able to pay the artists, but how do we? So I think that's kind of an internal dialogue we have a lot as an organization. But I think also during COVID, the height of COVID, we didn't feel safe having events in our building, which forced us to look outside in our community, which I think was actually kind of a silver lining. And so we ended up having a series of concerts outdoors in our community. It ended up being cool. On a church locally that had a lawn that they let us use for free, which was really generous. And so we just had some really great bluegrass and indie rock bands that played there over the course of about 2 years. And it was a really magical experience. And people brought picnics and they hung out and they got to know the artists because it was such a casual environment. And so I think that there's a lot of, we've talked about potentially doing like a solstice party someday where we have it outdoors and we have a fire and people can bring something that means something to them and then throw it in the fire if they want. I don't know. So we try to think about how do we bring art out in the community. I think part of that too, my role as executive director is making myself seen out in the community as a community member. And so I'm not necessarily inclined to be a chamber member, but I am the chamber director, and I have been for a few years because I show up and I'm trying to support the people that are here. And that's led to, I'm also the chair of a rural entrepreneurial venture program that's happening in Caledonia right now. And I'm trying to show up in the community so that people get to see my face again in this setting and know me as the arts lady, and that I'm nice and I'm approachable and they can come into our space. And that's another avenue that I can talk about what we're doing at Mainspring and just get a pulse for what the community is. For example, with this entrepreneurial venture program, we're hearing about different things that our community is lacking. We've heard that there's not a great space for teens to gather and to connect. And so that's why we really try to focus on teens and providing free art classes for them. We've heard different things about it'd be great to have more rental spaces for different events. So we've leaned into that a little bit. Having kitchens that people can use for their cottage, farmers market food wares that they have. And so we're considering that in our basement renovation that will be upcoming in the next, 5 years is something. How do we listen to what the community wants and make sure that we're in those spaces to hear those conversations and can reflect that within our organization? So that's just some of the things that came to mind.
It's interesting because for creativity and art, you need constraints, right? If you just have all the tools, you have all the budget, you have all the time, you're not going to do anything great. I promise. It's just not going to work. Once you've mastered the craft and had many years or hours, maybe, and most people aren't that disciplined. And I think in urban wealthy centers, there's a bit of a pop art vibe always. It's like the tracks that people are in tend to be similar to what other people are doing. And I think that's part of just human nature, but it's also you're chasing funding, right? It's usually like, what are the grantors doing or what are people buying, that kind of stuff. And you have a community of folks and people do different things or divergent stuff or innovative things, but it tends to be pretty rare that I see really interesting stuff come out of those. It's more, I think, people who go to those centers to either launch or refine and that are doing interesting things. Like they've already established their work or their style or whatever they're doing, and then they go into that culture and then get discovered or get better or whatever. But I heard you mention like the word community like probably 50 times in that that last response. And it's interesting because it feels like you're having to do a lot of, I think what other industries might call outreach. I feel like in again, established major urban centers or even rural centers that have established art communities, people are going to you. They're going to your plays. They're going to your music. You've had that. But Mainspring's doing something a little bit different. It's almost like a community arts organization versus like an arts organization, I guess, in a standard idea. Is that accurate? Or like,
yeah,
it just,
that's
it
literally
seems
how
like,
we describe ourselves. Community arts organization. So
awesome. Yep. I got it right.
Yep.
And I think that's really interesting too, because I think it takes out a lot of the elitism of arts, right? You go to the opera, and for a lot of people, they probably haven't even heard an opera, especially live or with a really good company doing it. Mm-hmm. But there's this kind of, I think, impression that people have. And by bringing out to the community, it's like you're the one who has to do that translation layer of saying, maybe people love painting, maybe they don't, maybe they've never been exposed to it before. Mm-hmm. But we see a need and identify that as teens don't have time or don't have a place to be and make that accessible. But do you find that like you get overlaps with like education? A lot of people are looking down on education for all sorts of different reasons. Higher ed is the same way. And I mean, everyone's, been to school, and it was never cool to learn, even though I'm a nerd and I love learning, but most people probably be like, I have to go do it. But do you get any, do you butt up against any of that? I know there's a lot of politics involved in that right now, at least in the States, where an arts outreach organization is, I think, very different than like a community education class. A lot of universities or schools will put on programming where you can come learn a skill or take a class in painting or something. Or is it more of like an activity thing? Like in urban areas, if folks are listening to this, there's I call it paint by numbers, just a little pejorative, but you can go take a painting class with someone where you paint a pretty quote unquote easy to do thing. It's not any super complex, but they teach you a little bit about composition and color and you kind of mimicry, and then you give your own flair, and you usually maybe have some wine or beer or something. And it's just kind of a fun activity. So I guess the question, in a really long way of asking it, is, are you seeing any like extreme parallels to you just getting lumped into kind of like an educational institution, or are you able to more walk that line of like community focused, like a hub or like a destination?
Yeah, I think we're honestly still coming into our own identity within the community. But the last couple of years, we really have pushed this education focus in terms of seeing a hole that was there and people requesting classes. And so we really tried to meet that need and offer some classes. I don't think that's going to always be like our main focus, and it isn't our main focus right now either. It's one of our focuses. But I think something that I'm really interested in, like, for example, when I worked in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, I worked at the Loft Literary Center, which is a wonderful literary community organization. And they, at the time, noticed that there was not a lot of, I mean, this is still the case in many places, but there was not a lot of representation of BIPOC authors in specifically children's and young adult literature. And with that lack of representation means, these kids are growing up and not seeing themselves in books, which is a problem. So they looked at that problem and thought, how do we provide resources and support for writers who maybe want to write in that genre but have never had the exposure or the experience or the whatever they need to get to that point. And so they started a mentorship program that has, paired writers who are published in those fields and in that genre, and with writers who are interested. They apply to this whole program and get accepted, and they spend a whole year in mentorship with these authors. And since then, the population of writers that I know of in the state of Minnesota, at least, in BIPOC writers in children and young adult literature, has ballooned, and it's amazing. And so I think we're thinking of that similar model at Mainspring of, for example, when I work in Lanesboro, which is a county over, and it's a town that has a lot of tourism. It's even smaller than Caledonia, but it's really driven by tourists in the summer especially. And so it has a professional theater company, it has an art gallery, it has artists who live and work in that area because there's been a lot of support there over the last couple decades to build that. That wasn't always the case. And so we look at Caledonia, which doesn't, in Houston County, which was the county we're in, and we don't necessarily have a lot of visible artists, but I know we have a lot of artistic people here. And I know that people sometimes leave this place because they don't feel like they have a place or support systems to do their work here. And so what I'm interested in is one of our next projects that we're hoping to get a grant for is our mentorship series, where we would be able to pair artists in these rural places with artists or people who maybe aren't even artists yet, but have that interest and that drive of developing those skills And they can work with these artists over whatever period of time we decide in a mentorship, artistic mentorship. And so that's just like one way I'm excited about the growth of our organization, where we can go. But I think it's taken us time. So we opened in June of 2019, so like 6 months before the pandemic hit. And then we had to completely change our whole entire organization. So I think we're still figuring out where we want to go and what takes time to absorb what the community is needing, what we see in the community, and how we can support that. And I feel like we're just getting to that point of trying to walk both those worlds.
I think that's an excellent point. And for people who don't know anything about Lanesboro is like, what, 500 people?
750.
Yeah. So it's a really, really, we talk rural, like that's about as rural as you get, where you actually have civilization, right? You have a few restaurants, you have a little grocery store. I think there's a gas station. And that's about it, right? And then there's some lodging. Like you said, there's a lot of tourism, but they also have a theater. They have galleries. They have all sorts of stuff I know that comes in and out during the summer, because winter in Minnesota really sucks if people don't know. It's cold and snows a lot, and stuff still happens, but the pace kind of changes. But if they can do it there, any so-called rural area should be able to support arts. Because I often hear it's just like there isn't support in rural communities for art. And that's bullshit. It's just straight up bullshit. It's different. And I think there's probably a lot less money, which is the ultimate resource. But I've been to other little communities all across the United States, frankly. They tend to be a little bit more tourism dependent to try to bring in some of those resources or create more of a destination. But at the same time, they also really support local community. And a lot of the people who are in the company lives there. A lot of people who have art in the gallery are from the area. They're not bringing in the so-called national stuff, right? But it's a really hard flywheel problem. I talk a lot about tech stuff because that's what I do. But you're running a community arts organization. That's a startup, right? It's a startup business. And it's probably even more difficult than software, because you have real people that you have to interact with all the time, in addition to then bringing in real people to consume or participate as well. What's the number one thing that you need? If I could wave a magic wand and like make it change, what would your thing be that, like, if you just to take you to the next level?
Oh God. Thing? I don't know if I can narrow it down. I guess funding then.
Yeah.
So, which I will say, as you were speaking, the state of Minnesota is a really great place for the arts, or for arts in general, because we have the Minnesota State Arts Board, which there was a legacy amendment in the state of Minnesota. I can't remember how many years ago it was. But as part of that, it sets aside tax dollars from every Minnesotan for things like the environment, for historical societies, and then specifically, there's an arts and cultural heritage fund. And that then trickles out into this Minnesota State Arts Board, which then trickles out into regional arts councils, which then trickles out into a lot of other ways. And so that is why I think at one point we were like second to New York in terms of funding for the arts in the nation.
Public funding,
yes.
Yep.
Thank you. And we also have some great private funders like the McKnight Foundation and the Jerome Foundation and all of that too. And so we are a really great place to be for the arts currently. I don't know what the next administration will do. There's been some talk about some of these national, federal, or state funding, whatever it is, going away. I do think Minnesota will still always have some sort of statewide support. But yeah, I have also noticed that funders are shifting. In the last 5 to 7 years especially, I've seen a shift from before. When you're rural, it was really hard to get funding. It was hard to prove impact because they were looking at impact from the lens of an urban environment. You have to have numbers and seats.
Tens of thousands of people consuming your event or whatever. Yeah.
But I think they're starting to realize, especially with the last 10 years of elections, the urban-rural divide conversations and all that has come up, that you can't neglect these rural places, because I always talk about how at Mainspring our impact is small and that we have small audiences. Sometimes some of our youth classes were like 3 students, but the impact on those 3 students was very deep and very meaningful because they didn't have that anywhere else. And so how do we look at it from a rural lens of, the numbers aren't going to be as huge as they're going to be in urban environments, but the impact is still there and it's still important. And I think funders are starting to see that. And so now you'll see that a lot of funders specifically will say that the populations they're looking to serve are BIPOC artists and organizations and communities, and rural urban organizations and communities. And so those are the 2 areas that they're really seeing a lack of support right now and are responding, which is exciting to see. Again, I don't know what the next 4 years will bring in terms of that. But I think that is a conversation that I've seen happening a lot.
And I think you hit on something important too, that, America invented social welfare for the most part. And we definitely popularized it, right? America invented free education, K-12, right? We decided that everybody should be able to read. And the way to do that was to pump a bunch of teachers out into rural America, because at the time, nobody lived really in cities. Population centers were very small. And we put a bunch of resources into it. And it's been pretty good up until maybe the last 15 years or so. And Minnesota, I think, has a really good system for the most part. It typically ranks in the top 10 or top 20 of states for almost everything: quality of life, expense, low expenses. I know a lot of people listening to this in the area might think that it's cracked, that it's still really expensive, but compared to places like Oregon, we don't have anything like that, really. We have regional arts councils that I think get a little bit of indirect funding from the state, but nothing at all like the Legacy Arts Amendment in Minnesota. And it's been around long enough. I voted for it when I lived there, and I haven't lived there for a long time. But in Portland, we have an arts tax, right? So everybody who lives here, who makes over whatever amount, pays it's a vanishingly small amount of money. They pull it up. A lot of it goes to K-12 schools to fund art teachers and theater and that kind of stuff. But then we also put in public funding of private artists for city beautification. They'll do murals or sculpture, or I think they organize shows and stuff in gallery spaces for people too. And the value of this stuff is really hard to hit on, because I feel like if everybody has to make a living wage that's doing work, doing art means your art piece is going to be probably hundreds or thousands of dollars. And a lot of people probably look at that as it's too much or that's ridiculous. But it's like when you need the plumber to come to your house to get the toilet unstopped or to get the sewer line clear, you're paying hundreds or thousands of dollars for that too, right? So the value of arts is something I always like to talk to people about, because it's historically it's people who have privilege, who have money to be able to do it, or get lucky and get some kind of support. And it's almost always private support. But in America, we have a very good public art system at large compared to Europe. Europe, everything's private. It's weird. Mm-hmm. And I want to call that out because it's a really unique thing. And like you said, I think it's probably under threat. Everybody always wants to cut this stuff. And the reality is the investment that you make is not even proportional to literally anything else in a budget. And you mentioned there's a class or something where you had 3 people. And one of those people might be the next Picasso. They might be the next, Edward Norton does all the films. They might be the next poet laureate. They might be the next person who makes the more beautiful car that you have.
Mm-hmm. And or it might be as simple as one of our students I know had experienced some bullying at the schools, and this was a place where she felt safe and was not subjected to bullies. I think we can both think about it in these grand things, but there's also these really tangible daily things that I think art and art spaces have the capacity to impact in a positive way and I think especially with our current world today and the country and everything that's happening, I really want to make it clear that Mainspring is a safe place for queer kids, for BIPOC kids, for people who don't have access to a lot of money or resources. This is still a place for you, and especially for you. So I do think that that's something that I try to push back on is even if they're not the next Picasso, which maybe they will be, and also it might just be something that really adds to their life right now that is really important and they need that place, Yeah.
And that's a good point. And I would argue, again, I try to break this stuff down and de-intellectualize it, because it's the investment in Mainspring grant, publicly funded grant, call it $500 to put on an arts class where you make an impact in 3 people's lives. It's $150 a person. That is so much cheaper than emergency room visits for mental health or long-term psychiatric care or right. And I feel like it's not a zero-sum conversation, but that's all I've been hearing recently with this, the national narrative on we have to cut funds. Yes, we're spending more money than we make in the United States at the federal level, and we do have to do some things differently. But there's all sorts of intangible impacts that art has to people and communities that it's incredibly difficult to manage. You hit on that a little bit with the grantors, where it was always the urban. It's like tickets and seats, or like, number of days run in a gallery. It's just what I call vanity metrics when I work in corporate. They don't really mean anything. And okay, 10,000 people saw it. Did it impact them in any way, or did they never come back? Like, you never know. And I know it's hard to measure that stuff, so I want to call it out, but it's kind of like you just have to trust the system a little bit too, right? And I feel like that is gone in the last few years, especially post-COVID, is like no one trusts anything anymore, and there's so much bullshit on the internet that people trust that for some reason. How would you approach somebody who's maybe never done art before, or never really done one? Because like, I just can kind of I can think back to one of the first few times I went to something like this. It was weird to me because I'd never done it. I wasn't really cultured in art. I had a little bit of education in it, but nothing really formal. I've taken to liking it, but like, I'm listening to this maybe and I'm, around in the area, or I'm in another area in the United States where it's more rural. And is there a good way to find this kind of stuff? Maybe like we'll link to Mainspring, obviously, but like, is there like a Rural Art Council national thing that people can go to, or like, how do I find it? And then what do you have for tips for going? Maybe I'm afraid I don't really know what I'm going to experience.
Yeah, great questions. I talk a lot about Springboard for the Arts in everything I do because I love them so much. They're a great organization, but they have a lot of free resources for both artists and people who want to learn more about art. And so I suggest their website for sure. And I think they have a lot of partners across the Midwest, especially. I guess that's what I can speak to.
Sure.
And I would just look at their list of their partners and see if there's one in a state near you or in the state that you live in, and look there. I know Arts Midwest does a lot of work as well. So looking to them, signing up for their newsletter. I always find out about a new community somewhere rural that is doing a really cool program. So those are just two that come off the top of my head.
What should I know going to an art center or a gallery showing or some sort of a event at a space that I've gone to a movie, probably. I know what a movie theater's like, or maybe I've gone to a sporting event. Can you walk us through a little bit of what is it like to go to Mainspring for some sort of an event?
Yeah, I think with every event that we do, we try to make it cozy and welcoming. And we're in what used to be a church building, a Presbyterian church. And it feels both a little lofty because it is very high ceilings. There's stained glass windows that thankfully are just like geometric shapes. They're not depictions of anything specific. And also it's a space that people have been gathering in community for decades. People who used to go to church that folded in the 90s. But even then there used to be 4-H clubs that met in the basement. And then when it was owned by the Historical Society, people went there for their annual book sale. So people of many walks of life have gathered in community in this building. And so I get people coming in. We had our first reverie is what we called it. It's our annual fundraiser event. But it was this really magical moment where we put like little slips of paper around the room that said, I went to 4-H here, or I went to the book sale here, or whatever. And we placed bells by them, and people would ring the bells throughout the social hour if they had done those things. And it was just this like magical moment of bringing all of those ways that this space has served this community together in the room. And it made people feel like, okay, I can be here. And for example, one of our big COVID lockdown time projects was a community cookbook, because we really looked at what other churches around here had done. We're not a church at all in ourselves, but we love the tradition of church cookbooks and how that is gathering of culture. And so we had placed cookbooks around the space too, when we had done this, that people could find the recipe that their great aunt had put in the church cookbook in the 80s. And now they submitted to our cookbook, which is out there in the world. And so there's just little things like that I think we try to always make sure it feels cozy. We have a lot of quilts and blankets in the space. And I think we just are presentable. We always are at the door. We're always greeting people. We're always trying to, every time I do a welcome speech, I try to give the context of what this event is, because I know a lot of people aren't used to going to an arts event that has some modern dancers who might be going up and down the aisles. And what the heck does that mean? So just trying to give that context and making it, giving people permission to sit with maybe something a little different. And I think something we talk a lot about is curiosity, and how we really hope that our space leads people to curiosity. It opens people up to be safe enough to be curious. And so I think that's something that we try to embody in our events and the way that we host them, because we really do view ourselves as hosts.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that a little bit. I feel like a lot of American arts are a passive experience. You go to the gallery, you look at the art. You go to the museum, you look at the art. You watch a movie, you go to a concert. You're not really actively participating. And I'm wondering too if folks might be a little uncomfortable with that. So like if I want to go to one of these, but I'm not really sure, like you said, maybe there's like bell ringing or something. And I don't know if I'm really into that, but like, is it cool if I just come and just hang out and just take
Absolutely.
it in? And yeah, cool. Cause I mean, I encourage everybody to go ring a bell, like go do the thing. But I think the passive consumption of everything in this, especially like Netflix, all this shit, it's okay to just be in the space, right? You don't have to participate. I encourage it. You should try it, but no one's going to badger you or make fun of you for not doing it. And every kind of like I love interactive stuff. I'm actually going up to Vancouver, Canada, end of the month to go to a dinner theater murder mystery.
Yeah,
I'm really looking forward. And then they like bring you in, to the performance. And they, abduct you, I guess, out of dinner or something. But hopefully I don't get murdered and I can finish my food. But I think a lot of people, that might be a little uncomfortable, but people are usually respectful. If you're like, I'm not really interested, or people pick up on the body language and they're not going to badger you or anything.
And I should say, too, none of this is ever forced upon anyone. It's very passive. We like to have passive activities that if people want to come for the social hour, for example, we do a lot of social hours before our concerts and things just to have that community space. But it's totally optional. You don't have to come for that part. You can just, because we'll post, this is the social hour, and this is when the event itself is happening. If you come during the social hour, you can just hang out and eat food and stare at the wall if you want, or you could go around, ring a bell, or sometimes we have other like fill in the blank poem type things you can participate on. But it's all very passive. No one's walking around being like, will you do this? So I think the key is really providing multiple opportunities for people to engage, whether that be just coming to the event and just being there. And that's great. We love it. We want that. And also if you want to engage a little more, there's an option for that too. So I definitely think it's meeting people where they're at across a lot of different, as a rural organization, we have to think about that. We can't just be like a textile center because we have enough people in the population to support that. We have to diversify our revenue. We have to diversify our program areas because we have to really reach a lot of the very small population that we have access to bring them in.
And that requires probably more funding too, right? Because if you have a dedicated textile community, you can specialize and focus in that. Whereas you're trying to be like a multidisciplinary exposure experience, which I think that's even cooler than like big city urban centers. You go to the gallery, you go to the theater, you go to the opera, right? You don't get a lot of like circus style stuff or aerial stuff. I love going to those things. Those are super creative. They're working in all sorts of different movement, different dance, different music. But like in really large cities, you don't tend to get that kind of stuff because it just, they can't do it, right? Or it's too out there. So you actually have the opportunity to kind of mix and match a little bit, which I think is really cool. I would challenge folks too, if you're the kind of people who go to the opera, the theater, or you fly to New York or LA and do your thing, maybe take one less trip or go to one less opera or one less musical performance and go check out something in a rural area. Go stay the night or do a long weekend and get out of the rut. Because I feel like a lot of the urban center support of arts, it becomes this, it'll be a little pejorative, but performative culture, a part of it. And it's a social event and it's kind of a be seen kind of thing. But your $500 opera ticket is way more impactful in a rural area. Go to the performance, donate the rest of the money to that organization. And that $500 is going to make way more of an impact to way more people and way more lives than it would going to the opera one less time. And then they'll be fine. The urban centers will be fine, right? I'm not worried about a massive outflow of funding. I don't want to defund the arts, just to be clear, but I want to spread it around a little bit more, right?
And I have heard there's a lot of, especially in the Twin Cities, specifically Minneapolis, St. Paul, there are a lot of organizations that are going out of business, I think, because COVID especially just made it really hard for a lot of people to survive, organizations to survive. And I think the funding, because we're in a rural area and now the funders are really looking to support those areas finally, I think there is some natural, lack of support happening in the Twin Cities or in bigger cities that is hard to see too. So I think that, like everything, it's nuanced. It is hard. There are dollars coming to rural spaces that have needed it for literally decades. And also that might mean that there's some really wonderful urban organizations that are no longer able to make it. And I know that numbers in terms of, I used to work at professional theater in the Twin Cities called Northrop, and they host international dance companies and the jazz series and all of this. And that tickets for those types of things were going down because people are going out less to go to these very like institutional experiences of art. And I think there is like growing pains in all of these areas in terms of, okay, if populations aren't wanting to go to that type of experiences often, how are you going to meet the people where they are now? And how do you shift your programming to reflect what people currently want to engage in terms of the arts? Exactly. And then again, as a rural organization that has to diversify all of our thinking, that we're used to being that agile. We're used to operating on shoestring budgets, which I don't think should be the way it is, but that's what we're currently working with. Yeah. And how do we scale that in a way that's sustainable is something we're working on. But I do think it's really important to think about just the whole ecosystem as a whole. It definitely, one thing affects the other, and it all kind of plays together.
Here's a better idea. Get rid of your Netflix and Hulu for a month and go see their art performance. How about that?
Yes, I like that.
Take a few months off Prime.
Yep.
I always like to end and wrap up with, is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't? Or is there something else you'd like to bring up and talk about?
I feel like we've covered a lot, but I do think just my biggest thing of being in these real spaces is, in order to see systemic change, you have to be a part of the system to change it. We need people across the whole spectrum. We need people who are disruptors. We need people who are going to build bridges. We need people who are doing all the things. But I view one of the important roles, and the role that I can embody well with my current strengths as who I am, is being a part of the system that sometimes is uncomfortable. And I guess I want to end with, it sounds all rosy and beautiful and rural places are amazing, and they are. And also there's a lot of racism here. There's a lot of homophobia here. There's a lot of things that I work with on a daily basis that are really disheartening. And sometimes I can get to the point, especially during the height of COVID times, like, why am I doing this? Is this making any impact? It was so hard to see impact when you couldn't see people in front of you. But I think what I always come back to is, if I want a system to change, and in this case, that system or community is my rural community, I have to be a part of that community in order to change it. And so that's where I'm at. And I think there's a lot of people in rural places who are doing that work, and we need lots of encouragement and support. So yeah, I think that's what I'll leave you with.
That's awesome. I really appreciate you calling that out too, because I live on the West Coast in a pretty liberally progressive place. Well, one of the
just a little bit
in the country probably. But I often hear a lot of people advocating for the lack of participation in things that they don't agree with or things that make them uncomfortable. And I think that that's the absolute worst idea that you can possibly perpetuate. Yeah, I don't really want to be friends with a bunch of racists, but if I just don't ever interact with them or don't ever talk to them, it creates that divide. And like this rural urban divide that we've been talking about is the same way, right? Like the big city people blank, or the small town people blank. Well, that's a generalization. It's spoken out of prejudice. And check your privilege, check your prejudice, get creative, and go explore. And try something else. Try talking to people in the local restaurant or at the coffee shop or whatever. And yeah, they're probably going to say some shit that you don't agree with or don't like, but that used to be okay, right? You don't have to like everything everybody says. You don't have to agree with everything anybody says, but people are so quick, and on both sides of the political divide too, to just shut down the other side or just ignore it. And we can't function that way. It's like actually like really inhumane. To just, shut out or other people. And I love that you called it out too, and that you put yourself into those positions, and in that it's probably not fun all the time for you either. But I think it's a net benefit for probably you as a person in personal growth, but also obviously the community and everyone else. And you shouldn't have to shoulder that full burden either. There are other people need to do the same thing. And so I'll just call that out as the host, and everyone can get pissed at me.
Well, I think I'm lucky to have people in this community that are doing that work too. And I think then that's what you need to just remember, is rural places, there are people around you who agree with what you do. They sometimes just need a way to connect or a place to gather. And that's what I hope Mainspring ultimately can be for people. This is a safe place to gather.
And I think if you don't have this kind of thing in your community, maybe look a little harder. Because like I've lived in some small places, I've lived in big places. There's always people. And sometimes it just takes like you to put up a little note on the local bulletin board at the restaurant or the coffee shop saying, hey, I want to play a music, or I want to paint, or I want to talk about books, or whatever you're interested in, making it publicly available, finding a Facebook group or whatever the fuck people use now. And I think it's really easy to create online community across the globe and the nation. And it's a lot harder to do that stuff locally. But get off the goddamn phone or computer and go meet with someone, have a cup of coffee, have a tea, or have a soda or wherever, and just talk to somebody for 20 minutes about what you're interested in. And you'll eventually do that enough, you'll find other people, and then you get started, right? Because I'm assuming you just didn't like waltz into town from the big city and then just start this whole arts endeavor, right? It was probably a really, really long process that took a lot to get off the ground and meet people again, right?
Absolutely. And I think too, if you see that it's still not happening in a community and you want to start it, reach out to me. I can give you lots of tips and pointers of what to do and not to do. And obviously every community is different, but there's a lot of people doing this work across the country that are more than willing to reach out and have a phone conversation or a Zoom conversation with you. And you can always learn something from another community, even though they're different from your own.
100%. The last question I'd like to end with is, are you reading something or consuming something that you think other people might be interested in? It doesn't have to be about any of this.
Oh gosh, I am looking right now at, every Christmas, I try to get the kids in my life, so my nieces and nephews and children, books. I always do a present and a book. I'm me. And so I'm right now looking at Faith Ringgold's Tar Beach, which is a wonderful book about textiles and quilts and community. But incredible, both author, and she was a textile artist herself. And that's one of the books I give out almost every time to a new kid in my life. Cool. So it's a kid's book, but there you go.
Well, that's fine. We'll link to it. Well, thanks for taking the time and for sitting down for the chat. It was great.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, it's great.
You can find us at 38.com. It's like the word create, but with a 3 instead of the C. As always, we encourage you to listen, watch, do. We'll see you next time. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/38 or at ko-fi.com/38. Thanks for listening.